So, welcome everyone. It is October 30th, 2014, the day before Halloween, and we're really pleased that you can join us today for a conversation that we've entitled Looking at Student Writing to Inform Teaching as Part of Professional Development, to which many of us who have been in classrooms and led professional development respond, how else would you inform professional development other than looking at student writing? But today's webinar is one in an ongoing series that's brought to you by the National Writing Project, and we're highlighting the work of local sites and engaging in an exchange of ideas and resources in these professional conversations to share what we're learning. I'm Pat Fox, Associate Director at the National Writing Project, and I'll be hosting today. And I want to thank you all for joining us, both in the chat room and our presenters that will meet in a few moments. But before we get started, just a few logistics in the form of a brief orientation to our format and the website. If you're with us live, we hope you'll join us in the chat. And if you want to participate in the chat, you will have to log into the webinar using Safari as your browser. I think that's noted on the web page. We don't actually know why this is, but it's the only way to be able to view the webinar and participate in the chat on the same page. So once you're in Safari, you may need also to sign up for chat role in order to be able to participate, and you can do that at http:// After you've signed up, you'll see a chat widget on the home page for the webinar, and we hope we'll see you there and hope you'll join in on the conversation. We really would like this to feel like the kinds of professional conversations that we know and love, and we'd love your voice to enter in at any point that you feel you have something to add or to prompt us to elaborate. I also want to point out that the resources that you'll hear mentioned during the conversation today are available on the webinar page. I think they should appear above the actual screen in which you see our presenters. And at the end of today's live webinar, the video and the chat archive and all the resources will be available for later access at any point. Or should you want to point any of your colleagues who can't be here today live back to the website, they'll find everything here. So before we bring in our guests, we wanted to just frame this in a brief history and some context to situate the work that we'll be hearing about. So as most of us know, this is the 40th year of the National Writing Project, and in our 40-year history of offering high-quality professional development, NWP has always prioritized extending the reach of its programs, and most recently with a real focus on extensive long-term professional development to serve the highest need schools. And in the past several years, we've been funded by seed grants from the U.S. Department of Education that's supporting effective educator development. And over 100 local NWP sites in more than 35 states have been engaged in developing school and district partnerships and leading year-long and in some cases multi-year embedded professional development programs in elementary, middle, and high schools that have focused on the teaching of writing as part of challenging college and career-ready standards. As we know, NWP has a long history of offering high-quality professional development with partner schools, and at this particular moment of new standards and renewed emphasis on writing, local sites are increasingly called upon to offer PD in the teaching of writing that demonstrates an impact not only on teaching practice but actually on student writing. Our work has always been at the forefront of professional development in the teaching of writing, and NWP sites over time have developed many ways of looking closely and over time at student writing as it progresses, with the purpose of informing next steps both for teachers and for student writers. Many of us that go way back to our feet on the ground in classrooms. I know I bring a background of 7th grade English, middle school teaching. This is very familiar to me from my own classroom-based teacher research days. So we have with us today site leaders from 2 local sites, each of whom has a long history of leading successful professional development, and they're here to share what they've learned about the essential elements of successful partnerships. That is, partnerships that have had a measurable positive impact on classroom teaching practice and student performance. So to lead us in today's conversation, we've invited Karen Smith and Julie Webb from the Area 3 Writing Project at the University of California, Davis, and Bruce Penniman and Stephanie Joyce from the Western Massachusetts Writing Project at University of Massachusetts Amherst. We're delighted to have you here. Thank you all for joining us.
Good to be with you, Pat.
You're welcome.
Really pleased to be here.
So let's bring Karen in here first. Karen's the director of the Area 3 Writing Project at Davis. And Karen, I wonder if you can start us off with a little background on the site and the context of the professional development partnerships that Area 3's been involved with.
Yes, I apologize because I think I'm a little behind. The video's behind what I'm saying because of my bandwidth. So we've been working. We actually have quite a few urban and rural districts, along with some suburban districts. And this is one of our large urban districts. This district is one of the largest districts in California, and it's Oak Ridge Elementary School. It's in the Sacramento City Unified School District. And Oak Ridge is considered a priority school. Several years ago, the district identified 7 schools, both elementary, middle school, and high school, that were to be considered priority schools. They were given extra funding by the district. They also were, other grants were made available to them. And most of them have very high EL populations, along with low SES, or high needs populations in terms of socioeconomic status. This school in particular, we started working with them about 5 years ago in 2009, and our work has changed over the years a little bit depending on the needs. When we started there, they were a new priority school, and they had some changes in staffing, mostly because the teaching staff was a little bit transitory in the first couple of years. They had extra requirements because of their priority school status in terms of time. They had a longer school day. They were compensated for that, but they were required to stay longer. They had many more meetings, and there were some different things for them that made it not the perfect fit for some of the teachers. So several teachers chose to leave about 3 years ago. But over the last 2 years, the staff has stabilized for sure. So because the staff has changed, we've had to change what we've been working with them as well. We've had to catch some new staff up, review for some of the old staff, but we feel like we're finally in a place where there's a little bit more consistency. When we started the professional development, they asked us for a focus on the 6 traits of writing, a little bit of writing workshop. They wanted kind of the basics of writing. What is writing? They didn't really know where to start. They were using a language arts program, a reading program that wasn't strong in the area of teaching writing, which isn't surprising. And but some of the tensions we were dealing with was they also were focused on the California state standards at the time, and then now Common Core, and really focused on only very small genre, or I should say small ways of looking at genres of writing. So they they wanted to make sure everybody covered things, so they would have, everybody's doing informational writing this month, and they would have a certain timeline, and the teachers didn't have a lot of flexibility in their scheduling. we've sort of been working with that to try to get them out of that, and we've been somewhat successful, but Julie can tell you that. And then about 3 years ago, they adopted the program Being a Writer, which is published by the Developmental Studies Center. And Being a Writer is a program written in a writer's workshop format, heavily uses mentor text. The lessons are written in a very clear way. And that's been good and bad. At the time that they adopted it, they also were really trying to get their teachers to not be dependent on programs. So they were coming out of this long time of, quote, fidelity to the program, and so they were trying to get their teachers to not be dependent on programs. And then they bought Being a Writer, and they weren't sure how to communicate that to teachers in terms of how it might be helpful or not helpful. So some used it, some didn't use it, and some halfway used it. And Julie may know more about how much they're using it now. So Julie's been working exclusively with Oak Ridge for the last 2 years, and she's working K-6 all the way across the K-6. We're super lucky to have her because very few of our teacher leaders could really dig as deep as she is in all those grade levels. And she has 15 years of teaching experience in K2, and also she was a K6 reading specialist, and she's a national board certified teacher as well. So when she started, I think, with the primary, and then as our work continued and we met with them, we really felt like she was a good match for K6, and she is thrilling me beyond a doubt, that's for sure, because she can flex with what they need, and she changes according to their needs and talking with them, and she's been amazing. So I'll let her tell you more about the specific work. And I'm going to check out, I think, of the camera since I'm so off, so you'll see my initials there, but I'll pop in when I talk.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, Julie.
Hi.
So Karen mentioned something that you had talked about in one of our planning conversations, which is this flexibility, this kind of organic model where you really began by getting a sense of where the teachers were and worked very dialogically with them, and you know, that your underlying principle was to meet them where they are and be responsive over time.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, what Karen's kind of describing, you know, where we are now, working with Oak Ridge, an example of kind of how that organically works is I was just there a couple of weeks ago and working with different grade levels, and in a second grade conversation, we were kind of unearthing some of the issues students were having with narrative writing, and we really wanted to, you know, work on tying character into setting and character actions and resolution even more tightly than the students had been doing. And based on that identified need, we were able to plan a new lesson together. And then the next day, I was able to demonstrate it for the team, and we were also able to debrief together. So to really see it full circle in such an immediate way allows me to be really responsive to their needs in you know, the most timely fashion possible. And then that in turn lets them be responsive to their student needs. And we didn't necessarily start out that way, of course, because as Karen said, we've been working as a writing project with Oak Ridge for 5 years, and she mentioned I started working just with first and second grades, and then now, you know, several years later, working with the whole staff. And when I really use student work to fuel our professional development topics and even the approaches we use, I really just like to start by asking teachers really to bring any samples they have, whether it's an on-demand piece or something, you know, drafted in writer's notebook, anything that's meaningful to them, and then really asking them open-ended questions such as, you know, what is it that you notice? What are you wondering about? And based on their responses, it gives me an idea of what type of content are they focusing on, what's their schema, you know, for writing instruction, what strategies, you know, are their go-to strategies, what are they kind of relying on. It allows me to really think about the language they're using, and based on that, I get a good sense of really, as you said, meeting teachers where they are so that we can build on their strengths. And actually, in one of the documents that we have from Area 3 is a protocol that I used recently with the staff. And if that can be brought up on the screen, I can, of course, start talking about it now. But since we are at a good place, with this staff, we've had a lot of opportunity over the years to look at student work, and the students or the teachers, as Karen mentioned, have had a lot of training in sixth trace and genre study, and their content knowledge is very, very solid at this point, which is really very exciting, and really gives credit to the hard work that they're doing at their site with their staff. But because of that, now when we look at student work, our language has really shifted, and even in the document that we're going to bring up with the protocol, I even have some examples of the language shifts, because you can tell, back then, and this is just kind of typical language, this isn't necessarily even just Oak Ridge. I experience this a lot with staffs where I noticed teachers starting really just focusing on conventions, and they're certainly focusing, basically coming from a deficit model of what's wrong with student writing. And over time, with some content know-how, and some strategies under their belt, and really shifting that by modeling from me and others, moving to an additive approach of what are the strengths that students are coming with. And you can see in the language how not only the content, the instructional content that teachers focus on is definitely elevated and much more insightful, I think, but it's also a much more positive view of what their students can do. And teachers start not only just talking about the piece in front of them, but even in their writing classrooms, the excitement that students are experiencing. And that's kind of really gives us some momentum, to build from. And so to get to that point, though, when using a protocol I find really helpful, because I think it gives the structure to the conversation that a staff really needs. And it allows all teachers to have a voice, and to make it a comfortable and kind of safe environment to really talk about, really sincere issues that students are having and struggles that maybe even teachers are having, because we know writing instruction can be very challenging, but of course also very rewarding. So within that protocol, what's in the document is we start out, as I mentioned, just very briefly, what is it that you notice? And the protocol that I designed here, I used recently with each grade level separately, because I find in small groups it works a little bit better. It doesn't necessarily have to be grade level, but it could be, a content area, or even cross-grade level teams is a really nice way to look at student work as well. But we really looked at what is it that we're noticing, and I asked teachers to go ahead and actually write those things down for themselves. So it gives them some time to really think about and be thoughtful about the student work that they have. And then I asked them to jot down, kind of categorize those thoughts. What are the strengths? What are the challenges that they're seeing? And what are the questions that are coming to mind, the things that they're wondering about? And there it is on the screen.
Julie, excuse me, Julie, can you let me know if you're seeing the correct page?
Yes, it just popped up. It's the right one. Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks.
And so, and actually, if you notice on that document, the little box off to the right that says charts, I had a chart, just blank chart paper basically, where we were jotting down each of these things so that we had a record, as a group of what we were looking at, and then those are left with the staff for them to build on and refer to. And so I just have that listed off to the side, so when I use this protocol again, I know what charts to kind of, have ready for the group. So we start charting those responses of what strengths are they seeing, what are the challenges they're seeing, and like I mentioned, the questions or things that they're wondering about, why are students, still having this struggle, or I wonder, why this is occurring, or that type of thing. And we move into, based on that discussion, we even move into what are some of the things that we can really talk about that we're really glad to see, or even things we're surprised to see, both in a negative, positive way, based on things that don't necessarily show up on paper, like the writing climate, the writing communities being established in the school, the levels of motivation of the writers, those types of more qualitative things. And certainly that's good information for me because I don't teach there every day. So to be able to hear about those successes as well is meaningful, and it's also really a morale builder for the staff because they have worked so hard to make those things happen. So to honor that side of writing as well. And so through that, based on those responses, then we actually move into, now we have a big picture of our writers, where they are, that additive approach again of their strengths, and moving into knowing at the time they were working on narrative writing. Each grade level is a little different. Some were, personal narrative, recount type of things. Some were moving into realistic fiction, different types of narrative writing. And we were able to take all the information we had gathered together and start to craft some goals, from writing goals for the remainder of that trimester for the teachers. To make those really clear so that we weren't thinking too broadly about our instruction, but really focused on what the kids needed and what our standards are really asking kids to do. And then generating mini lesson topics and really starting to flesh that out, what strategies we could use to match up with certain content that the kids needed. And that really allows everyone in the room to really make positive contributions and to really share some great strategies and practices going on. So it's not just me, the facilitator, doing those things, that everyone's contributing to that. So let's see. Part of really through this process, I think the next document has the formative assessment graph. Yeah, this is I just put this graphic here to kind of remind us about the formative assessment process. These are actually the direct language that comes from the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. I think they did a particularly nice job clarifying, and they have a great definition of formative assessment. But you can see the 4 components there of clarifying your intended learning and the evidence you're trying to elicit and analyze and interpret and then act upon to make changes for students. And so with that protocol, we're really we're modeling for teachers what a formative assessment process looks like in a professional development setting. So, we're based on the student evidence we had in front of us. We could do some pretty serious interpretation together, decide what needs to be acted upon, and then once again crafting those goals for the students, and then moving forward. And how we're going to elicit evidence and move that into the classroom. And we're lucky that because of our relationship with the staff and the trust and rapport that we've built over the years, they're very welcoming to me and to others in their classrooms to provide demonstration lessons of some of the things that they really like to see. And co-planning things that are happening with their team members, co-planning with me. And it's been a very dynamic relationship and experience that I think certainly staff has benefited from, I've benefited from, and I know the students have as well. And the administration is really trying to work with teachers, in particular this year, on the formative assessment process. Because as Karen mentioned, in the Sacramento City Unified School District, they relied very heavily in the past on the adopted curriculum and not straying from that. And so for a lot of teachers who've only taught in this district, or maybe haven't taught, for all that long, this is really, that's where they're coming from, is that experience. And so to design their own lessons, they feel like they're designing out of thin air almost, but to really understand that formative assessment process, it's not a struggle, I would say. It's just a new way of thinking, and to really be as responsive as they can to their student needs in a timely way is something that the district has not promoted over the years. And I think that's certainly making a change district-wide. And I think Oak Ridge really has benefited not only their school kind of being pioneers in that area, but I think the district's taking notice because of their success with their students.
And from what you've said, the kind of dialogue between and among teachers that they've created their own professional learning community, that not only their language on kind of a granular level in talking about student writing has changed, but probably the professional conversations that they have
Right.
have changed in dramatic ways. We do have a question, and I missed this earlier in the screen sharing. But somebody in the audience wanted to know, is being a writer a key part of looking at student work, or how does the work that you're describing and being a writer finally coexist?
Right. As Karen mentioned, that was one of the programs that they chose to adopt just at the site several years ago. They actually have other programs such as Lucy Calkins Units of Study, resources available to them, and even as a district, they recently have purchased the Core Ready program by Pam Allen. So along with even just the general, kind of reading program that the school's been using. So being a writer is just one of the resources teachers are using, and I know they do use it at different levels. Some teachers really they think the launch part of that program for Writer's Workshop is really effective for them. They really like the balance between content and 6 traits with building that kind of writing community, and that program does a very good job of that. But they're also finding great resources in the other programs that they have. And other resources in one another, and then resources that the Writing Project has brought to them. So they really take the best of everything and make their best effort to give things a try and share with one another what's working, what's taking longer than they thought, what's a good match for their students right now. And they, once again, in that formative process or formative assessment process, they're every year trying something new and noticing their students are further along in their writing development, so they can maybe try things they couldn't do a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. That harkens back to one of the basic assumptions of the National Writing Project that will be familiar to some of us who've been around for decades, which is that we don't espouse any single approach, that we draw eclectically from a range of what works in any particular situation at any particular moment with any particular student. So it sounds like a rich, just a rich environment and a rich exchange of ideas. Thank you, Julie. Let me just say that we had a comment about being able to read the documents. Please let us know if you're having any trouble reading them. We'll try to be a little bit more narratively descriptive of what's on the screen, so that you can orient yourself and also know that you can go back and take a closer look later on. So thanks again, Julie. We really appreciate that. So let's move across the country, literally, from California to Massachusetts, and hear from our colleagues Bruce and Stephanie at the Western Massachusetts Writing Project. So Bruce, let's start with you and ask you, as a director with a long history with the site, to start us off, as Karen did, with some background and context about the work that we'll be hearing about in a little bit greater detail from Stephanie.
Sure, happy to, Pat. I'm sorry to sound a bit nasally here, but it's head cold season in New England, and I'm afraid I got caught. But anyway, like the Area 3 Writing Project, the Western Mass Writing Project serves an area that includes a very wide variety of districts, which range from the second and third largest cities in the state to towns that are so small that they have only one school. In Massachusetts, school systems are city and town governed, so our 4 counties have well over 100 districts in them. For our seed grant, our first high needs seed grant, we selected a school in Holyoke. Holyoke is a medium-sized, I would call, post-industrial city with a history of underperforming schools. It was once a model industrial site with numerous large factories, but it's now struggling with chronic unemployment and trying to reinvent itself in the new digital economy. And unlike the other districts in Western Mass, Holyoke has a predominantly Latino student body, almost 80% of the students, and they are primarily Puerto Rican students. 85% of the students in the district are low income. Almost half speak English as a second language, and 29% are English language learners. The graduation rate is under 50% for students of color there and only 22% for ELLs. So the state classifies Holyoke as a level 4 district, which means that it needs intervention. And that was because in the last state test, no subgroups met performance targets. So it needs intervention, and Holyoke has had a lot of intervention, so much that teachers suffer from initiative overload there. Unfortunately, much of the professional development that they've received has been short-term and very strategy-oriented training rather than a sustained investment in teacher capacity. Our writing project site actually has a long history of working with Holyoke teachers, but primarily for ELL training. We had state-mandated courses on sheltered instruction, and for many years provided several of those per year to the Holyoke system. The SEED grant was our first extended professional development focused on writing instruction. For our project, we worked with the middle grades at the Donahue School, which is a K-8 school, and the theme we chose for the professional development after surveying the faculty was growing as teachers of writing. And the course included writing across the content areas, writing workshop practices, reading writing connections, and looking at student work. Our liaison in the school was a literacy coach named Margaret Bartley, and I remember that in my first conversation with her, she said, we have gotten very good at generating data here, but we don't know what to do with it. We have no way of looking at student writing in a systematic way that impacts teaching practice. Our team of teacher consultants in the school included Kevin Hodgson, a 6th grade teacher with a strong background in technology, Jack Sykowski, a former middle school science teacher who's now teaching teachers at Elms College, and Stephanie Joyce, an elementary literacy specialist with a lot of expertise in writing workshop. She's led numerous professional development programs for WMWP, and she's with us here.
We are fortunate to have Stephanie, and I think you're going to find a lot of points in common with both the underlying principles and the practices that Julie described, Stephanie. So welcome. Let's have you jump in here and tell us about some of your work in Holyoke.
Yes, thank you. So Bruce has really laid a nice foundation for this, and I appreciate your mentioning some of the parallels that may exist between the information that Julie shared. One of the things that's strikingly different from the work that we did in Holyoke is that we didn't have the opportunity to be there doing that kind of lesson study and kind of ongoing work with teachers. So it was a year-long course, but we really weren't there in the day to model lessons and be in classrooms. We would have liked that opportunity, but it didn't exist for us. So the focus of the work that we were doing, I'd say, was about kind of fivefold. We were helping teachers implement effective routines and structures to support writing workshop, which was a new practice to them. We were trying to help them build writing communities for teachers and students to be writing daily. We were helping them develop a working understanding of Common Core writing standards, which were relatively new at that time, and we were helping them know about that for curricular planning and writing across content areas. Both. And then a fourth area, which really was very instrumental, was working with best practices in writing to use ongoing assessment and to increase their repertoire of strategies to teach writing, and also to teach ways of working with writing as a tool for learning. And then the fifth dimension was very important to us, was really fostering inquiry and collaboration among these teachers to support them in planning so that they could apply their learning that they were getting from our course to the teaching of writing, obviously for improved student outcomes. So I think it's helpful Pat had shared that it would be helpful for us to work from a framework of kind of what we did and why we did it and how we did it, and I'd kind of like to start with some of the what's that we did. And there were three key things, and largely centered around that fourth dimension of our work that I mentioned around best practices in the teaching of writing and the use of ongoing assessment in writing. So the first thing we did was to help teachers learn to use a continuum of writing development that was focused on some key qualities of writing: structure, elaboration, the concept of writing or craft of writing, and meaning or significance of writing, and to use that continuum of writing development to analyze student writing samples. And the continuum that we used was specifically the continuum of narrative writing from Teachers College Reading and Writing Project. And I know that we've provided that link for colleagues who are with us today or may tune in at a later time. The second part of that work that in terms of what we did was to really help teachers keep a lens on student writing from an asset-based perspective rather than a deficit-based perspective, which is very parallel to what Julie was describing. So really helping them look at what students can do, what they were doing in their writing, what they were on the cusp of doing, what they were using but confusing. And that was a very different approach for these teachers. And we did that through the use of T-charts that were simply constructed. One side was if the writer is doing this, if the writer is on the cusp of doing this, if the writer's using this but confusing this, then the right side of the T-chart was then the then side. Then what would we do next? And I'll talk about how we kind of got to filling in those charts. And then the third aspect of really what we did was to help teachers learn to use all this data that they were collecting. So as they analyzed student writing, what could we really do with that work? And as Bruce said, that was something that we had really gleaned from the teachers as something that was really instrumental to them. Because like many of us, and I think a lot of the other work that I do in professional development, I hear frequently from teachers that I'm being asked to score writing and give writing prompts and do on-demand writing, and we really never see what happens to those scores. We're filling databases pretty effectively, but we don't know as much about really how to analyze that writing or what to do with it. So some of the things that we did in relation to helping them understand how to use the data was to use it to determine what next steps would be in their whole group teaching, and in very targeted differentiation for writers, either in conferring or in small group strategy work. We wanted to support them in using that data to determine flexible small groups that they could put together. How could we see groupings of students that had particular needs as writers? We also wanted them to use that data then to think about how would you develop strings of teaching points on a particular writing craft or on a part of the writing process, again to use in whole class lessons or in small group instruction. And a fourth part of that was that we really wanted to let them understand the use of data from analyzing student writing so that they could begin to craft their own teacher demo writing in a way that would meet the typical needs of the class as they were modeling in mini lessons and doing their teacher demo writing in front of students. And one of the ways that we expanded that was to support them in thinking about their own teacher demo writing going into a writing conferring toolkit. And that writing could be used then as they move from writer to writer or from small group to small group. They could use that writing to coach from or to model from as they conferred with writers. When I think about a writing conferring toolkit, I'm really thinking about maybe a binder of some kind with pockets in it, or just some kind of a plastic pocketed folder that's got lots of inserts in it, so that you might have your conferring record-keeping notes in there. You might have, for certain grade levels, you might have word walls or vocabulary lists. You might have mini copies of your anchor charts in your classroom so that you could have them at tabletop and model with students. You might be carrying around lots of post-it notes in your conferring toolkit so that you could be leaving tracks of your teaching with students. You might have in there certainly this kind of writing that I'm describing, where the writing that the teachers were crafting of their own that writing would go into the toolkit as well. So it was really something that was very portable that you could move around to work with your students. And then the final aspect of helping them use the data that they were collecting as they analyzed student writing was to be able to select some student writing as mentor texts so that they could be modeling writing craft from that and use as exemplars in learning progressions, or to use them on mentor anchor charts, so that if a piece of writing was going up on a mentor anchor chart, or a slice of student writing was going on an anchor chart, it was to indicate that that piece of writing was really modeling something that was featured on the anchor chart, and could be annotated in a way that could point out certain craft moves that a writer had done. So when I think about why we decided to approach the work that way, I kind of go back to Pat's beginning comments about how else would you do professional development with teachers? Of course, you would look at student writing, but as Bruce said, these teachers were very weary and frankly leery from the years of professional development that they had had that strictly focused on programs and marketing of those programs as a method of professional development. So the way in which we approached Writing Project professional development was frankly a real breath of fresh air for them and an opportunity to really wrap their thinking around their student work. So really why we did this was to help them analyze the student writing in a way that would help them know that they were doing much more than just filling a database, that they could see that the scoring of their writing prompts, of their on-demand writing, was really helping them to do something more than meet an obligation to fill a database. We wanted, another reason that we did this was to obviously learn how to use a tool like the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project Continuum of Narrative Writing that would support an ongoing analysis to both guide their instruction and to strengthen the feedback loop between teachers and their writers. We wanted that feedback loop to enable them to give very specific compliments to writers, to be really naming in very explicit ways, but simple ways, what it was that a writer was doing. And then to be able to develop teaching points that would readily transfer from one piece of writing to the next, rather than just teaching into a particular piece of writing. So as we know, it was really a way to be teaching the writer and not the writing. A third reason that we were approaching the work with student writing in this professional development was on how the analysis of their own students' writing, again, could support them in knowing how to craft their own teacher demo writing. And we wanted them to realize that their writing couldn't be too simple, nor could it be too far out of reach for the writers in their class, but that the stories that they were crafting in front of students had to kind of match the zone of proximal development of their writers. I think it also helped, although I'm not going to tell you that this was initially our rationale, I think we learned that this was part of it, that it really helped some teachers just learn how to write narrative stories. That when we think about that shift from just summarizing in stories to really telling the story, I think it helps some teachers to really do that with their own writing, and frankly to take risks with writing in front of their students to model their own writing life. And then finally, another part of our rationale was in helping teachers know how to develop very collaborative practices around analyzing student writing and using inquiry that could support the teachers in both sharing the load for developing lessons themselves once the analysis of the writing was done and we had determined the needs of the students. They could share in the writing of those lessons for very targeted instructional work. They could have ways of meeting students with much more effective practices, and frankly we were hoping and we were pleased to have it prove out that we were supporting them in developing more consistency in school-wide practices. So I think that Julie mentioned before about the shifts in language that she saw in the school that she worked with in Oak Ridge, and we certainly saw that in Holyoke as well. There began to be a consistency around language around writing that was important, and it honored the kind of importance of writing in the school and the celebrations that took place as well.
So Stephanie, I'm going to, because I can see Julie kind kind of nodding and responding, and it feels as if at this point you've kind of converged on many common threads between the two of you. I wonder if Julie wants to jump in and react to what you've been saying.
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like I was alongside her doing this training, even though I'm across the country. It is pretty amazing. Well, what I was thinking about in general when Stephanie was describing, some of their approaches and how they accomplished what they did, it makes me think about some of the professional development, our teachers across the country have been really subjected to, right? And this very kind of external, use the word marketing, that's a great way to describe it, this kind of external approach to professional development. And really what we're describing and what National Writing Project certainly is promoting with teachers is really professional growth. Something that is, very timely, it's meaningful. We both mentioned, really meeting teachers where they are, and they can in turn meet students where they are. And that's, I think, a really key difference as to the successes and why things have improved for staff and students.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So thanks. Stephanie, I didn't want to interrupt you. So you were going to tell us a bit more about how the what the looking at student writing looked like in the heart of professional development.
Sure. So I can add a little bit about how we approach this, both with mentor samples of student writing, as well as with writing from the classrooms of the teachers we were working with, because a goal throughout our work was to keep this learning for the teachers very embedded close to their own practices. So it was important to us that the teachers had the opportunity to certainly use their own students' writing. It was also part of our emphasis on how writing could foster, again, that feedback loop for writers, and how the emphasis was on the teaching of the writer and not the writing. So we had teachers we worked with narrative writing because there was certainly a pressing need, but that's the way we began the year with them as well. And we had teachers review a set of their student writing and divide them into 3 piles. So there was a pile of writing of students that were meeting grade level benchmarks, or approximately meeting them. There was a smaller pile to one side of writers that were exceeding bench level standards for grade level, and then another smaller pile of students that were really striving and really having to work very hard to be anywhere near grade level benchmarks. So it was kind of reflective of, not that we can certainly divide classrooms into 3 piles, but it was reflective of the typical kinds of needs that teachers were seeing in their classrooms. And then we introduced a writing sample and led teachers. We introduced a mentor sample of writing from the narrative continuum, and we led teachers into reading and analyzing that piece of writing just to begin to find examples of qualities of writing that they could see in that piece of writing, and to work with that. I think you'll see then perhaps on a screenshot that Pat might assist us with that. That's when we began to use the T-charts that simply are in an if-then format. So we started with a blank if-then chart, and supported teachers in collaborating with one another, a lot of talking and sharing of ideas about what could be reflected on the left side. If the writer was doing these things or approximating these things, how could we begin to list out some of the qualities of writing that teachers were seeing. And then literally to hold the narrative continuum beside us and flip to the next level of writing in the continuum and look across the lines of development to consider what this particular writer needed to do next. And then we invited teachers to use that next level to then begin to fill in the then side of the chart. And I think what was important about that was that we were focused there on what are kind of the the skills that writers would need to do next in terms of filling out that then side of the chart. But then we had to move beyond that to help them fill in what are the strategies that we need to be teaching into to get to those skills. So I've also shared as one of the resources that will be available to colleagues after the webinar is a sample at about a level 7 in the narrative continuum. You'll see a completed if-then chart to give you an idea of the kind of work that we did together. One of the things that's mentioned in that level 7 example is the idea of working with sensory details for writers that are kind of where the setting is still tucked into the action. The idea of working with more sensory details and a little bit of figurative language. And so one of the techniques that I shared is the idea of using a sensory web. And so I think we may have a screenshot of the idea of a sensory web, or at least that will be available to colleagues again on the in the link that will be for the webinar. So we went on to practice, then has teachers practice with their own student writing. And then we had teachers take a piece of writing, and one teacher would play the role of the teacher, and one teacher would play the role of the student of that piece of writing. And teachers literally practiced giving a very explicit compliment then to that writer, who was one of their colleagues taking on the role. And then articulating both the compliment and then a teaching point that might follow as a next step for that writer. So it was an opportunity to model a next step then with their own writing and really show students what might happen at a notch of writing above their own level. We found that this was a practice that really strengthened the feedback loop as we were helping teachers see how to differentiate for writers. They learned to give a compliment, they learned to consider a teaching point for growth for that writer, and then help the writer perhaps set a goal for their own writing.
So let me just feed in a comment from the chat room, which is somebody loved the opportunity to analyze successful writing to determine the qualities that make it successful. Mm. You know, and I think you've both kind of emphasized the asset model of writing rather than a deficit model, and I think that was evident in Julie's analysis of the shifts in language, the ways in which teachers at the beginning approached a piece of writing, which tended to be deficit oriented, and over time that they learned this. I think in one of our conversations we talked about that really simple workshop model that looks at a piece of student writing at whatever level and says, what does this writer know how to do? And in any piece of student writing, a writer actually knows how to do a lot. Mm-hmm. And then the next kind of generative question to interrogate the piece is, what is this writer on the brink of being able to learn? What is this writer going to learn how to do next? So just that shift, which you can talk about pretty quickly, but I don't know, it actually happens over a period of time through all of the kinds of establishing ways of looking and talking and being together that result from this particular orientation toward professional development. Let me also say that that there may have been a problem in terms of the way that the permissions to look at the resources were set up when I added them to the web page. So I'll go back in and make sure that there's open access to all those resources as soon as we finish. So we actually have about 5 minutes left. So I'd like to invite, and I know that we probably could have done another hour, and that would have given me some practice on getting screenshots up in a timely fashion. But another thing that was pointed out about the platform is because the video widget on the webinar page is actually fairly tiny. It's not a full screen. That seeing what was written on the resources was a bit of a challenge, and people will have to go back and look at those afterwards. But I say with some great confidence that there is cornucopia of wonderful things for folks to do. But I'm going to invite everybody at this point to jump in and extend the conversation or speak to anything that you've heard.
I'll jump in. I want to bounce off what you just said, Pat, and then relate it to Stephanie and Julie. I think the idea of looking at student work in this way may be difficult at first for teachers because they're used to wrong and right, especially in other subject areas, I guess. And so it's natural, or it may be a natural for them to look at what they notice is wrong, which often is conventions is what they notice. But what I heard from both Stephanie and Julie is that when they're working with those teachers, showing them ways that, specific ways to teach writing and move the students' writing forward, it gives the teachers more to work with then in looking at the student work. I don't know if that makes sense. If you've seen a really strong lesson on, say, openings of a narrative, and so they've witnessed that from either a teacher consultant that comes in or from a colleague, then they have more to look at when they look at the student writing. The other thing I kind of thought of as you were also describing that the use of protocols is sometimes even, or looking at student work, sometimes it's even powerful to take one piece of student work and where nobody knows anything about the student writing at all, the student who wrote it at all, and they just say what they notice, and then they move on from there. And it takes away that sort of, the background we all bring to what we know about our students, and it just is what you see right there on the paper can be really powerful.
Absolutely. Thanks. Karen, we have another question about where looking at I'm getting feedback here. Let me make that how often do you look at student work, and do you have particular sessions where that are devoted to looking at student work, or is it kind of woven in to sessions that also cover some other approaches?
Well, I don't mind. I think it's both. It's valuable to have decide to really just looking at student work and thinking about next steps. And I think if you do that periodically, you begin to make habit, and that that approach but really, it should be an assessment process, and we want classrooms. It's something that we do need to build in, and especially for teachers who aren't used to do that. We need to get that into the forefront and get used to doing that on a daily basis. If you're walking around your classroom with students, you're looking at student work, making decisions on the spot, and that we're on our students and move them forward.
Thank you. Stephanie. We have about 30 seconds probably.
Well, maybe two quick. I'm not sure. I'm getting a lot of breaking up of dialogue. I'm not sure they're actually hearing. Can I begin with compliment as we're working with teachers on learning to analyze student writing and using have them focus, for several weeks maybe just on giving compliment conferences to writers, and knowing that if they don't feel confident about picking a next teaching point, that they do begin to grow more and more confident about looking at student writing and pulling out the qualities. As far as the question from the person in the chat room, the other thing that we've used successfully with is having teachers select maybe 3 students at the beginning of the year, and as they get together every time there's an on-demand piece of writing, which in some districts is at the beginning of every unit of study in writing, bring a piece of writing from those 3 writers. And over the course of the year, teachers on a grade level team keep looking at the same, 9 or 12 writers that present a cross-section of students in that grade level. And it is a way for teachers to build a collaborative practice around analyzing writing over a year.
Said to me that I am muted. I'm back, and the echo is gone. Thank you all so much for just a rich sharing. It feels as if we've just really begun to scratch the surface of some incredibly deep and thoughtful practice. So I'm looking forward to other forums for sharing. Please say, somebody just said, thank you, I'm leading a session on looking at student work on Monday, so this is particularly timely and helpful. That's wonderful. Thank you all, and we'll see you in DC.
Yes, thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.